Move further and study about the indifference curve analysis of demand, which we've already built a foundation of in the last chapter, where we studied cardinal utility, Marshallian cardinal utility analysis. Consumer preferences. The analysis of consumer behavior is concerned with the choice he makes among different goods or bundle of goods given his budget constraint. It is from the choices of quantities of goods given their prices that consumers make, um, that we derive demand curve for a good. In economics, it is assumed that consumers behave rationally in the choice of goods or bundle of goods for satisfaction of their wants. To explain consumer behavior, economists assume that consumers have a set of preferences which guide them in choosing among goods for their consumption. Okay, the preferences of different individuals differ substantially. For example, some individuals may prefer white shirt while others may prefer colored shirts. Likewise, some prefer apples, others like bananas, and so on. In real life, the consumers have to make a choice among several goods, but the use of two-dimensional diagrams compel us to limit um, us to two goods. However, economists use the concept of commodity, which represents all the other goods and the choice in between the two goods, um, while one of them is a composite good. So, as you would have seen, something like this demand curve, where x is a good x and y is said to be all other goods. So this is called a composite commodity, where you're assuming that everything else will be uh, within this, okay, which represents all the other goods. Okay. Since money represents general purchasing power which can buy other goods, it is taken as a composite commodity, okay, because it can buy everything else. Thus, with the help of the composite commodity, we can consider consumers' choice involving many goods and still use two-dimensional diagrams. Okay, let us explain uh, how we explain consumer preferences. Let x1 denote the quantity of good 1 and x2 denote the quantity of good 2. There's a bundle of two goods containing x1 of good 1 and x2 of good 2, which is quantity of good 1 and good 2 is denoted by this and is called the x bundle. Okay. Similarly, the other bundle consists of y1 amount of good 1 and y2 amount of good 2 and is called the y bundle. Okay. In theory, consumer preferences it is assumed that given the two bundles x1, x2 and y1, y2, the consumer is able to rank them in order of his preference. So according to whatever he prefers, he is able to rank them. In other words, a consumer can determine whether he strictly prefers one bundle of goods to the other one, or he's indifferent between the two bundles. Strictly prefers implies that he definitely likes the one over the other. Okay. This is called strict preference, that he is liking one good over or one bundle over the other bundle. This preference relation has an operational significance. If a person strictly prefers one bundle over the other, he will choose that one over the other one if there is an opportunity for him to have any of them. So if it is possible for a particular consumer to have any of them, he does not have any constraint uh, of, let's say, income, which is the most important constraint to consider, and if he is given both of those, he is going to choose that bundle over the other one. Thus, the consumer's choice and demand for goods will depend on whether he strictly prefers one bundle over the other. Thus, if a consumer always chooses bundle x1, x2 when bundle y1, y2 is available, he prefers x1, x2 to y1, y2. Okay, so this is our understanding that strict preference is basically shown like this. Okay, that's how you show strict preference. Further, if the consumer shows his indifference between the two bundles, it means he derives the same satisfaction from consuming bundle X as the other bundle Y. Okay, so in that case, that's how you show indifference. Okay, very, very bad drawing. Okay, so if you remember similarity of triangles, it's the same sort of um, representation. Okay. There is a third case which occurs if the consumer either prefers or is indifferent between um, the two. Okay. Let me just underline the important portions right now. If the consumer either prefers or is indifferent between the two bundles, it is said that the consumer weakly prefers one basket X1 X2 to the other available basket Y1 Y2 of the two goods. This weak preference has been used by J.R. Hicks in his revision of demand theory based on logical ordering. In his analysis of weak ordering preference hypothesis, Hicks assumes that when a person chooses one bundle to other goods of two goods from among the several bundles of two goods available to him, it means he either prefers the chosen combination over all the others available, or he will be indifferent between the chosen one and some others available. Okay, so he's either so if he when a person chooses one bundle of goods from among several bundles of two goods available to him, so if he has several bundles and he's choosing this one bundle, he is either it means he either prefers the chosen combination over all others available, or he is just indifferent. Okay, that's why he's just choosing this one, because he's indifferent, right? So it's just um, by coincidence. Thus, Hicks in his revised demand theory does not rule out the indifference of the chosen bundle with any other bundle of the two goods available to the consumer but not chosen. Thus, weekly preference implies that choice of bundles of good amongst several available to the consumer means that he does not strictly prefer the bundle, he chooses among the various alternative bundles available to him. It is likely, according to weekly preference hypothesis, that he may be indifferent between the chosen bundle and some other alternative bundle available to him. Okay, just the repetition of whatever we said here. Assumptions about consumer preference. In analyzing consumer behavior, economists usually make some crucial assumptions about the nature of the consumer preferences. It's referred to as axioms of consumer theory. There are three following assumptions. One is completeness. According to this assumption, the consumer is capable of ranking alternative bundles of goods for his consumption. So you're basically assuming that a person, if he's given to rank the bundles as to which one gives him more satisfaction, or which one would he buy given that he's all of these bundles available, he is going to be able to rank them. Okay, this implies that two bundles of goods, a consumer can rank them so that he either prefers one bundle to other or is indifferent between them. This assumption about complete consumer preference rules out the possibility that the consumer cannot decide which bundle is preferable. For example, if a person is offered a choice between an apple and orange and he chooses the apple, it means he prefers the apple. If he has no preference, he would not care which fruit, apple or orange, is given to him, since either of them will leave him equally satisfied, right? So which means he's indifferent. Second one is that the preferences of consumer is that consumer's preference over bundles of goods is consistent. According to this, if a consumer prefers bundle A to alternate bundle B and prefers B to C, then he will prefer A to C. Similarly, if a consumer is indifferent between the bundles A and B and between B and C, then he will also be indifferent between bundle A and C. Thus, the assumption of transitivity of preference implies that the consumer is able to rank all available goods in a consistent manner. He also is able to, transitivity assumes that completeness is basically being followed. In fact, transitivity principle implies that the consumer behavior is rational. So what it's saying is that you are indifferent between A and B, and if you are indifferent between if you prefer A to B and you prefer B to C, notations are really not the best thing in this. I'm so sorry. So transitivity basically says that you're going to prefer A to C as well. Okay. Okay. This is what we are saying in this case. This is basically an implication. Okay. So if A is preferred to B is preferred to C, then A is preferred to C. This is how you're going to write it basically. Okay. I'm in this case assuming that this is strict preference. Strict preference. All right. More is better. The third assumption about the consumer's preference is that all else remaining the same, more of a commodity is better than less. Okay, that is, more of a commodity is preferred to less of it. This implies that a person is not already satiated because of a person has already consumed so much of a good, then he is fully satisfied, then the extra amount of it would not give him more satisfaction. So you're basically going to assume this, and you'll see why, because we'll see the fact that a higher IC gives him higher satisfaction. Okay. It may, however, be noted that there are some things for which less of them is preferred to more, which is bads in economics. Okay. So this should also be noted. We'll see ICs for them as well. For example, pollution, smog, germs are bads, and then less of them is preferred to more. However, the standard economic theory does not deal with bads and explains consumer choice with regards to desirable combinations of goods. Okay. Let us see the indifference curve approach. Evolved to supersede the cardinal utility analysis of demand, which was discussed in the last chapter. The IC method seeks to derive all rules and laws about consumers' demand that are derivable from the cardinal utility analysis. At the same time, the inventors and supporters of the new method contend that their analysis is based on fewer and more reasonable assumptions. If you remember, this was one of the limitations of cardinal theory, that it was assuming too much and explaining too little. The IC analysis has, however, retained some of the assumptions of Marshall's cardinal utility analysis, as the indifference curve approach, like the old cardinal utility approach, assumes that the consumer possesses complete information about all the relevant aspects of the consumer environment in which he finds himself. So we are assuming, just like Marshallian utility analysis, that a consumer knows about everything, so he has complete information. For example, the price of goods, the market in which they're available, the satisfaction to be obtained from them, etc., are all known to the consumer. Further, it is assumed that the consumer acts rationally in the sense that given the price of goods and the money income, he will choose a combination from among the various possible combinations that gives him maximum satisfaction. Of course, you're also assuming that the consumer is rational, so whichever one of the combination of goods gives him maximum satisfaction, he is going to choose that one. Moreover, the assumption of continuity has also been retained by Hicks-Allen indifference curve method. Continuity assumption means that the consumer is capable of offering or ranking all conceivable combinations of goods according to the satisfaction they yield. Yeah. So this is again intuitive. Ordinal utility. The fundamental approach of IC analysis is that it has abandoned the concept of cardinal utility and instead has adopted the concept of ordinal utility. So the first thing that is different between the two approaches is that from cardinal utility we are now moving towards ordinal utility. According to the supporters of the IC theory, utility is a psychic entity and it cannot therefore be measured in quantitative cardinal terms. In other words, utility being a psychological feeling is not quantifiable. The concept of cardinal utility, according to the exponents of IC theory, is therefore untenable. On the other hand, the assumption of ordinal utility, according to them, is quite reasonable and realistic. The ordinal utility implies that the consumer is capable of simply comparing the different levels of satisfaction. So, as against the cardinal utility, which said that you could quantify the amount of satisfaction or utility you were getting from a particular good or combination of goods, here what we're saying or assuming, which is more understandable, is the fact that you are able to rank or compare the amount of utility you are getting from one combination or one good as versus the other combination or other good. In other words, according to ordinal utility hypothesis, while the consumer may not be able to indicate the exact amount of utility that he derives from the commodities or any combination of them, but he is capable of judging whether the satisfaction obtained from a good or a combination of goods is equal to, lower than, or higher than the other. So you're basically able to rank or compare between the two said bundles or goods. Notions of preference and indifference. For deriving the theory of consumer behavior, it is sufficient to assume that the consumer is able to rank his preferences consistently. Thus, the basis of indifference curve analysis of demand is the preference indifference hypothesis. This means that if the consumer is presented with a number of various combinations of good, he can order or rank them according to a scale of preferences. Okay, scale as to which one you prefer more than the other. If the various combinations are marked A, B, C, D, E, etc., the consumer can tell whether he prefers A to B, B to A, or is indifferent between them. Similarly, he can indicate his preference or indifference between any other pair of combinations. The concept of ordinal utility implies that the consumer cannot go beyond stating his preference or indifference. In other words, if the consumer happens to prefer A to B, he cannot tell by how much he prefers A to B. Okay. Thus, under ordinal utility hypothesis, the consumer cannot tell the quantitative differences between the various levels of satisfaction. He can simply compare them qualitatively. Sorry, that is, he can merely judge whether one level of satisfaction is higher than, lower than, or equal to the other. He is basically just able to rank, but not say the difference, not tell what the difference between the two of them could be. Okay, how much more or less utility one bundle of good or goods is having, one bundle of goods or good is having on him. That is, he can merely judge whether one level of satisfaction is higher than, lower than, or equal to the other. Further, according to the supporters of IC method, by how much one combination of goods is preferred to another is not even needed for deriving laws concerning consumers' behavior. It is sufficient to assume that the consumer is able to tell whether one combination of goods give him a higher, equal, or less than satisfaction. It may be noted that the consumer formulates a scale of preferences independently of the market price of goods, keeping in view only the satisfaction which he hopes to get from the various combinations of goods. So, he is able to scale the preferences independent of what the price of a particular good is. Okay, just based on the satisfaction he is deriving. In consumer scale of preferences, some combinations will occupy the same place. That is, the consumer will be indifferent among them, right? If you're indifferent between certain goods, then if you're saying number one is A, that you prefer A to B, then if let's say you are indifferent between B and C, so both B and C are going to be on 2. Okay. Um, the consumer will be indifferent between them. Combinations occupying a higher place in the scale will be preferred to the combinations occupying lower places in the scale. Moreover, the indifference curve analysis assumes that the preferences and indifference are transitive. Okay. The transitivity of preferences or indifference relation means that if a consumer prefers A to B and B to C, then he will also prefer A to C, and likewise it is indifferent between A and B and between B and C, then he will also be indifferent between A and C. Now let's move on to the assumptions of indifferent curve analysis. Before explaining the properties or attributes which the IC curve, indifference curve normally possesses, it will be useful if we first mention the assumptions about the behavior of the consumer, which are generally made in the IC analysis. The first one is that more of a commodity is better than less. We've already read about this. So, this is a non satiety assumption that you're not really satisfied at, say, one given point. If you're given more, you'll just take more. Okay. Preferences or indifferences of a consumer are transitive. Again, we've already said what this means more than once. Diminishing MRS. Now, this is something that we read already in the last chapter. So let's just recap and see what is written, or if there's anything different in the ordinal approach. In IC analysis, the principle of diminishing marginal rate of substitution is assumed. Okay, in other words, it is assumed that as more and more units of x are substituted for y, the consumer will be willing to give up fewer and fewer units of y for each additional unit of x. Or when more and more of y is substituted for x, he will be willing to give up successively fewer and fewer units of x for each additional unit of y. This rule about consumers' behavior is described as the principle of diminishing marginal rate of substitution. Principle allows as a matter of logical necessity from the assumption that particular wants are satiable and that various goods are not perfect substitutes of one another. So this remains the same. MRS is the marginal rate of substitution. When there is more and more of y um, substituted for x, he will be willing to give up successively fewer and fewer units of x for each additional unit of y. Okay. uh, let's move on to what exactly is this IC and indifference curve that we've been talking about for the last 2-3 pages. The basic tool of his Hicks-Allen ordinal utility analysis of demand is the IC, which represents all those combinations of goods which give some satisfaction to the consumer, same satisfaction to the consumer. uh, which is why it is called indifference curve. You're indifferent on that curve, which means that you're getting the same level of satisfaction when you stay on that particular curve. Since all combinations on an IC give equal satisfaction to the consumer, he will be indifferent between them. That is, it will not matter to him which one he gets. In other words, all combinations of two goods lying on the consumer's IC are equally desirable or equally preferred by him. To understand IC, it is better to start with indifference schedule. Um, Table 8.1 shows two indifference schedules. In each schedule, the amounts of good x and y in each combination are so much that the consumer is indifferent among the combinations in each schedule. In one, the consumer has to start with 1 unit of x and 12 units of y. Okay, 1 unit of x, 12 units of y. Now the consumer is asked to tell how much of good y will he be willing to give up for the gain of an additional unit of x. How much are you able or are you willing to give up of y to get one more unit of x? Okay. So that his level of satisfaction remains the same. If the gain of 1 unit of x compares to him as a loss of 4 units of y. Okay, so 12 minus 4, 8, and this is adding a 1 here. uh, Now you can just move on to this very analysis. In Schedule 2, the consumer is initially 2 units of X and 14 units of Y. By asking the consumer how much of Y is he prepared to abandon for the successive additions of X in his stock so that his satisfaction remains equal to what he derives from the initial combination, we get combinations 3x plus 10y, 4x plus 7y, and so on. This is nothing but 4 of x plus 7 of y. Okay. uh, but it should be borne in mind the consumer will prefer any combination schedule to any combination in schedule 1. That is, any combination schedule 2 will give him more satisfaction than any combination schedule 1. This is because it is assumed that more of a commodity is preferred to less of it. Okay, since we're getting more commodities in this one, okay, than we're getting in this one. Greater the quantity of good gives an individual more satisfaction than smaller quantity of it. The consumer, the quantities of other goods with him remaining the same. Initial combination in schedule 2 contains more of both the goods than the initial combination in schedule 1. Therefore, the former will give him greater satisfaction to the consumer than the latter. So why did we say this, if at all? Is that initial combination schedule 2 contains more of both than initial combination in schedule 1. So here we have 13 and here we have 16. Okay, which is why we're saying that more is good, and so we like 2 more than 1. Now, since each of the other combinations in indifference schedule 2 provides the consumer some satisfaction, same satisfaction as the initial combination 2x plus 14y, because that's what we said, right? We are substituting y for x for 1 unit of x, okay, and then we're checking what units of y are we ready to give up for one more unit of good x, so that we are on the same satisfaction curve. So so what exactly do we mean here is that all of the combinations in 2 are going to be on the same IC. We are indifferent between them. And also each of the other combinations in indifferent schedule one gives the same satisfaction as the initial combination, right? Same intuition. Any combination of schedule 2 will be preferred to or will yield greater satisfaction than the combination schedule 1. Already we've discussed this here. Now can we convert the ICs into indifferent schedules into ICs by plotting the various combinations on bar graph? In figure 8.1, an indifference curve IC is shown by plotting the various combinations of schedule 1. Okay, the quantity of good x is measured on the horizontal axis, quantity of y on the vertical axis. As in an indifference schedule, combinations lying on the IC will also be equally desirable to the consumer, that is, will give him same satisfaction. The smoothness and continuity of the IC means that goods in question are assumed to be perfectly divisible. You can divide those goods, they're perfectly divisible, because of which the IC is going to be a smooth curve. If the indifference schedule 2 is also converted into an IC, this will lie above the indifference curve. Why? Because we have assumed that the not assumed, we've also empirically proof that this one, the next IC is going to give greater satisfaction than the first one. Why? Because it contains more goods than the first one. Okay, let's just name it IC1. Okay, so this one is going to lie somewhere here. Terrible drawing, but yeah, would look something like this. Okay. uh, any combination on the higher IC will be preferred to any combination on the lower IC. So a higher IC will be preferred to a lower IC. Why? Because it has more number of goods, and we've assumed that more is better than less. It is thus clear that the indifference curve lying above and to the right of the IC will indicate a higher level of satisfaction. It may be noted that while an IC shows all combinations of two goods which provide equal satisfaction to the consumer, it does not exactly indicate how much satisfaction is derived by the consumer from those combinations, right? Because this is from the ordinal utility concept. So we don't know how much better one is from the other. That's because of the concept of ordinal utility does not involve the quantitative measurability of utility. Therefore, no attempt is made to label an IC curve by the amount of satisfaction it represents. Mathematically, utility function represented by the indifference curve of an individual in case of two goods x and y can be written as this. So while a is some constant in the ordinal sense, utility function u x y of an indifference curve can also take the following form. According to the above utility function, indifference curves will be convex and sloping downwards. Okay, from this function, what we can say is that they will be convex, so they'll be shaped like this, and they'll slope downwards and not upwards. It's not an upward sloping convex curve, which could look something like this. For different and higher levels, higher values of an indifference curve, there will be successively higher indifference curves. Okay, note further that even utility function, this will represent typically indifference curves because it's just a monotonic yeah. So this is thus clear that u xy square is just a square of utility function being a monotonic transformation. Okay. Similarly, this will also be the utility function of typical indifference curves. Okay. Similarly, this is also going to give you a typical IC. It may be noted that Marshallian cardinal utility suffered from a serious shortcoming as it rested on the restricted primitive assumption that the utilities of various goods were independent of each other, and hence the additive utility function of cardinal utility analysis takes the form of this. Okay, so you can basically add them all because the utility derived from one good was independent of the other good's utility, uh, where UXX is a total utility derived from the consumption of X units of good X. This is from utility derived from the consumer of consumption of Y units of good Y, and U is the aggregate utility. As mentioned above, the advocates of IC analysis have rejected the view of cardinal utility analysis that utilities of various goods are independent and additive. So they are not independent and not additive. It is important to note that the consumers use the concept of utility function to study about consumer behavior, but utility functions of individuals are not easily known. To obtain utility functions of individuals, a researcher asks a sufficiently large number of questions about the choice of bundles of goods in order to construct a utility function that correctly represents their preferences. Usually, consumers can easily answer questions about whether they prefer one bundle of goods to another, but they find it difficult to answer questions about how much more they prefer one bundle to another because they do not have a measure in which they can express their level of satisfaction, because it's more psychic than quantitatively determinable. Therefore, we are able to know only his rank ordering of bundles of goods, and we do not know how much more the consumer prefers one bundle to the other. In other words, we know only ordinal preference of individuals and not cardinal measures of utility. However, in the IC analysis, it is thought uh, sufficient to know only ordinal preferences. Okay, because the assumption is ordinal preferences. So of course they know the fact that we will not be able to figure out the ranks, etc., and hence sorry, we will not be able to figure out the difference of utility measures, etc., and hence the basis is ordinal preferences. um, it is thought sufficient to know only ordinal preference of consumers for deriving the conditions of consumer choice and derive the demand theorem stating the relationship between changes in price of a good and its quantity demanded. Indifference map. A complete description of consumers' taste and preferences can be represented by an indifference map, which consists of a set of indifference curves. Okay, indifference curve 1 is just, just like this one. Okay, so this is something that I drew, but this is an IC. Okay, but if you draw multiple such ICs, this becomes an indifference map. So this is now an indifference map. Okay, a complete description of consumers' taste and preferences can be represented by an indifference map, because the field in a two-dimensional diagram consists of an infinite number of points, each representing a combination of x and y. There will be infinite number of ICs, each passing through the combination of goods that are equally desirable to the consumer. In figure 8.2, an indifference map of a consumer is shown, which consists of 5 ICs. The consumer regards all combinations on the IC1 as giving him equal satisfaction. Similarly, all lying on IC2 will give him the same level of satisfaction, but the level of satisfaction on IC2 will be greater than the one on 1. Why? Because it's higher and to the right. Likewise, all higher ICs 3, 4, and 5 represent progressively higher and higher levels of satisfaction. It is important to remember that while the consumer will prefer any combination on the higher IC to any combination on the lower IC, but by how much he prefers one combination to the other is cannot be said. In other words, a higher IC represents a higher level of satisfaction than a lower IC, but by how much higher cannot be indicated. We already read all of this, and this is just probably just um, um, a reiteration. An indifference map of a consumer represents, as said earlier, his taste and preferences for the two goods and his preferences between the different combinations of them. In other words, an IC portrays a consumer's scale of preferences. Scale of preferences of IC represents uh, an IC analysis replaces Marshallian utility schedule so long as consumers' tastes and preferences remain unchanged. The whole IC indifference map will remain the same. If the consumer's taste and preferences undergo a change, then a new IC or indifference map corresponding to the new taste and preference will have to be drawn, because his taste and preferences themselves had changed. The scale of preferences will also be changed. If, for instance, good Y is eggs and good X is bread, and the doctor advises the consumer to take more of eggs to overcome some disease, the shape of his IC will change and his indifference map will be redrawn. Since the doctor's advice will intensify our consumer's desire for eggs, now a smaller quantity of eggs than before will be given up by him for a given increment in bread, because he needs to have more of eggs, so he will need to give up much more eggs than he did before for one more unit of bread. Let's carry this forward in the next lecture. Read into marginal rate of substitution. Thank you.